Robert Redford and Paul Newman. Two names that don't just belong to Hollywood, but to history itself. When people think about charm, friendship, and classic cinema, their faces appear instantly. They weren't just co-stars, they were legends. The golden duo, the perfect match. On screen, they seemed flawless, always laughing, always in sync, always unbeatable. But behind that polished image, there were shadows, untold truths, and personal battles that the public never saw. For decades, Robert Redford stayed quiet, guarding his friend's secrets out of loyalty. But now, at 89 years old, he has finally spoken. And what he reveals about Paul Newman is not the glossy story we grew up believing. It's raw, it's real, and it's filled with the kind of darkness that even legends couldn't escape. Their journey began with Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid in 1969. That movie didn't just make them stars, it made them icons. Redford was the Sundance Kid. Newman was Butch Cassidy. The chemistry was electric, natural, and unforgettable. Hollywood had never seen anything like it. The audience believed what they saw. Two men bound by adventure, humor, and unshakable trust. But what no one realized at the time was that Paul Newman was already hiding demons, and Robert Redford, the man who would become his closest friend, saw parts of Newman's life that few others ever did. Paul Newman was loved by millions. His blue eyes were his signature. His smile melted hearts. His career spanned decades with classics like The Hustler, Cool Hand Luke, and The Verdict. He even became a philanthropist, giving away millions through his Newman's Own food company. To the world, Newman was perfect, talented, kind, charitable, and unshakable. But Robert Redford remembers the man behind the curtain, and that man was deeply flawed, sometimes tortured, and far from the angelic figure Hollywood painted him to be. One of the darkest truths Redford reveals is Newman's relationship with alcohol. Fans might know Newman loved his beer, but they don't know the extent of his drinking. According to Redford, Newman could drink more than anyone else he had ever seen. It wasn't just casual, it was an escape from fame, from expectations, and from guilt that Newman carried inside. Redford recalls nights when Newman would drink until he couldn't stand, and mornings when he'd still find a way to be sharp on set. The world saw charisma. Redford saw the cost behind it. But alcohol wasn't the only shadow. Newman also carried guilt from his personal life. Few fans know how complicated his relationships were. He had a first marriage that ended in heartbreak, and for years he struggled to balance fame with family. His role as a husband and father wasn't always smooth. Redford remembers Newman opening up about regrets, missed moments with his children, fights at home, and the constant pressure of being Paul Newman, the perfect man in the eyes of strangers. That image was heavy, and it haunted him. Even their friendship, which looked so easy on screen, had hidden tensions. Redford admits that sometimes Newman's competitive side would show in private. Newman hated losing, whether it was on the racetrack, at cards, or even in small jokes. Redford laughed about it, but he knew it came from a place of insecurity. Behind the charm, Newman feared being second best. He needed to be number one, and sometimes that drive created quiet friction between them. Redford, though, respected it. He saw Newman not as a flawless hero, but as a man constantly wrestling with himself. At 89, Redford doesn't share these secrets to shame his friend. He shares them because he wants the world to see the whole truth. In his words, Paul was a great man, but he was also a man. And like every man, he had his battles. For Redford, holding these memories for so long was an act of loyalty. But with age, he feels the responsibility to show a fuller picture. Because hiding the darkness would mean hiding part of what made Newman human. The most heartbreaking revelation, though, is about Newman's loneliness. Despite his fame, despite his success, despite even his happy marriage with Joanne Woodward later in life, There were times Newman confessed to Redford that he felt empty. Fame gave him everything, but also took pieces away. Privacy, peace, and sometimes even trust. Redford recalls conversations late at night when Newman's laughter faded and his honesty came out. Newman would admit fears, doubts, and a deep question that haunted him. Will people ever see the real me? Paul Newman's talent was unmatched, but his shadows followed him everywhere. On the set, he was charming, funny, and magnetic. Fans loved the jokes, the sparkle in his eyes, and the confidence that made every line unforgettable. But off the set, Robert Redford saw the cracks in the mask. He saw the exhaustion after long days when Newman would retreat to his dressing room with a drink, trying to silence the noise inside his head. To most of the world, Newman looked untouchable. To Redford, he looked human, fragile, complicated, and sometimes even broken. Redford remembers moments when Newman confessed his guilt as a father. Fame had stolen time from his children. In interviews, Newman admitted he wasn't always present. But the truth, as Redford reveals, was heavier than people think. Newman carried regret over missed birthdays, missed school plays, and the years when his career meant more than being home. He loved his children, but fame was a thief that took away more than it gave. Redford says that sometimes Newman would sit quietly, drink in hand, staring at nothing, and whisper, "I wish I could have done more." These weren't lines from a movie. They were words of a man weighed down by regret. Then there was Newman's fear of being replaced. He had the looks, the fame, and the respect of Hollywood. But deep inside, he worried about the day the world would move on without him. Redford recalls how Newman sometimes joked about younger stars coming to steal his spotlight. But beneath, the joke was real insecurity. Hollywood is brutal. It builds legends and then forgets them. Newman knew that better than anyone, and sometimes it haunted him. Redford says that the pressure to always be Paul Newman the star pushed his friend deeper into alcohol, deeper into silence, and deeper into the parts of himself he never wanted to show the public. Even their friendship was tested by these struggles. On screen, they were brothers. Off-screen, they were brothers too, but real brothers fight, disagree, and sometimes wound each other. Redford admits that Newman could be stubborn, even controlling. He hated to be told he was wrong. He had to win every argument. And yet Redford never walked away. Why? Because behind Newman's pride was vulnerability. Redford knew the stubbornness was just a wall. He knew the alcohol was just a shield. And he knew the dark secrets Newman carried were not signs of weakness, but proof that he was human like everyone else. There was also Newman's obsession with control. Redford remembers that Newman needed everything to be perfect. His performances, his cars, his image. He hated mistakes, not just in himself, but in others. Sometimes, Redford says, Newman's perfectionism would create tension on set. But in private, Newman admitted why. He was terrified of failure. Terrified that if people saw his flaws, they wouldn't love him anymore. For Redford, this was the saddest truth. Because in his eyes, Newman didn't need to be perfect. He was already enough. But Newman never believed it. Another secret Newman kept hidden was his struggle with grief. His son Scott died in 1978 from an accidental overdose. The world knew the story, but few knew the depth of Newman's pain. Redford reveals that Scott's death was something Newman never truly recovered from. He blamed himself, carried guilt for years, and often drowned that pain in alcohol. Redford recalls that behind Newman's smile, there was always a shadow. After Scott's death, a quiet sadness that never left. Newman once told him, "You never stop asking yourself if you could have done more." That loss shaped him, haunted him, and became one of the deepest scars of his life. As the years passed, Redford watched his friend change. The wild energy softened. The jokes became quieter. The drinks became more frequent. But through it all, their bond never broke. Redford says that Newman was like a brother, and that loyalty kept him silent for decades. He never exposed Newman's demons, because protecting him mattered more than the truth. But now at 89, Redford feels a different kind of responsibility. The responsibility to show the world that Paul Newman was not just a legend, but a man who fought battles every day. Redford's revelations are not cruel. They are filled with respect. He wants people to understand that Newman's greatness was not in his perfection, but in his ability to keep going despite his flaws. Newman gave performances that will live forever. He built a charity that fed millions. He inspired generations with his charm, his talent, and his generosity. But none of that erases the struggles he carried in private. If anything, it makes them more powerful. Because Newman's story is not just about stardom. It's about the cost of stardom, the loneliness of fame, and the secrets even the brightest stars keep hidden. At 89, Redford admits he misses his friend every day. He says Newman was complicated, difficult at times, but also kind, loyal, and full of life. He wasn't perfect, Redford says, but he was real, and that's what made him great. For Redford, speaking these truths is not about tearing down a legend. It's about honoring him fully, both the light and the dark. Because only when you see both can you understand the man behind the myth. Redford also reflects on how their friendship shaped him. He says Newman taught him about resilience, about carrying on even when you're hurting inside. He taught him about generosity, about giving back without expecting anything in return. And yes, Newman taught him about flaws too, about how even the brightest stars can fall into shadows. Those lessons have stayed with Redford all his life. They've made him a better actor, a better friend, and in his own words, a man who understands that greatness is never simple. Today, as fans, look back on Newman. Redford hopes they see both sides, the hero and the human, the legend and the man, because only when you see both can you truly understand the depth of Paul Newman's story. He was brilliant but broken. He was generous but haunted. He was strong, but sometimes painfully fragile. That duality is what made him unforgettable, not just on screen, but in life. For Redford, revealing Newman's secrets at 89 is not an act of betrayal. It's an act of love. He wants the world to know that his friend's struggles do not erase his greatness. They add to it. They show that Newman was not some distant, flawless icon, but a man who lived with the same fears, regrets, and pain that so many of us face. And yet he still shone brighter than almost anyone. That is why Newman's legacy endures, why people still watch his films, still buy his products, still speak his name with admiration. As Redford's voice trembles with age, his words cut deep. Paul was real. That's what made him great. Not the perfection, not the fame, the reality. After all these years, after all the silence, Redford has finally let the truth out. Not to tarnish, but to complete. To give the world the whole picture of a man who was far more complex than his smile ever revealed. And so, at 89 years old, Robert Redford has given us one final gift, a reminder that even legends are human, and that sometimes the most powerful story is not the one told on screen, but the one carried in silence by a friend who never forgot. If you believe every legend has two sides, the light and the dark, don't just watch the story, share it.